Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Gidon Rothstein in our ongoing Mosaica Press series. Rabbi Rothstein is a noted educator, lecturer, writer, and author. Rabbi Rothstein received his rabbinic ordination Semicha from Yeshiva University and a Ph.D. in medieval Jewish history from Harvard University. Rabbi Rothstein's books, both nonfiction and fiction, include We're Missing the Point, What's Wrong with the Orthodox Jewish Community and How to Fix It, Murder in the Mikdash, which I take it is a fiction work.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, fiction.
The Making of the Messiah, 2048.
Also fiction.
Also fiction. As If We Were There, readings for Transformative Passover Experience. Cassandra misreads the book of Samuel. And today we'll be focusing on Rabbi Rothstein's new publication, The Judaism of the Poskim, Responsa, and the Nature of Orthodox Judaism, another gem in Mosaica Press's lineup of elegant, meaningful, and bold works. Thank you, Rabbi Rothstein, for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Just to get started, there it is, The Judaism of the Poskim. Just to start off, what is the thesis behind the Judaism of the Poskim?
So I have an overall thesis in life in general, which is that Torah comes together, and that when you take responsible Torah authors and you look at what they say, there's underlying things that unite all of them. So sometimes it seems fairly banal, and you can't, they all believe in God. Right? There are easy things, but I like this idea of looking at things and seeing what unites. So here you have this responsa literature. You have, Torah scholars, you have Gedolim from centuries answering questions. And I wanted to see, I hope to find, and I was looking to see, what is it that unites them? What is it that makes them the same or similar to each other? So the thesis is that underlying a broad sample of responsa, you find that their concerns end up being around the same types of topics. And these become the central topics that they're looking into and they're concerned about, they're thinking about. And if you know what those are, those form a sort of basic areas of awareness that we want to pay attention to and think of as being worth paying more attention to.
Okay, excellent. Who are the five leading rabbinic personalities that you utilized, not for all, but for a majority of the responsa studied, and why those five?
So it was the Chatam Sofer, Rav Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Tzitz Eliezer, and Rav Vadia Yosef. And why those five is, it's not coincidence, but it's closer to happenstance. And meaning, I started this project by finding a tshuva written on every day of the calendar. So today is the 17th of Av, of Menachem Av. I want to see a tshuva written on the 17th of Menachem Av. And my original thing was, it would be cool to have a set of tshuvot and learn them on the day on which they were written, and learn them on the anniversary and teach them and learn them on the anniversary. So I started doing that because going through. As I was going through, after the fact, I found I had gravitated towards those five. So it's probably a matter of, as I went through it and I saw options, they ended up being options that I liked a lot. I think it has to do with the fact that I think each one of them is largely very readable, and I think very interesting, and they were thinkers who thought in interesting and easily presentable ways. So I think that's what did it for me to make those the five. Now, it happens to be after the fact that I look at those five, I say to myself, that's not a terrible list of five poskim to have as be your center. Meaning the Chatam Sofer, as it happens in my samples, the Chatam Sofer ended up being the most quoted responsa by other respondents, which is remarkable because he lives in the 1800s. So you might have thought, let's say, the Rabbi Yehuda lives before him, or the Rashba lives before him, or whatever, and yet I found the Chatam Sofer is being quoted by later authors over and over and over again. And then Rav Moshe Feinstein is Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Vadia Yosef, Rav Vadia Yosef. I guess the weakest links, and I don't think they're weak links at all, Rav Uziel who I think is under recognized. I'm not sure why. I think there are probably a lot of reasons. One is that he was modern, not in the sense of like promoting secular studies, or modern in the sense of he, maybe more than other Poskim that I saw, had a sense that we're hitting a new era and we have to make sure we apply halacha properly and appropriately to that new era. And others aren't as conscious of that. And I think that might be something that was a reason why he didn't make it. I'm not sure. Could be that he was part of the new state and that was still sort of trafe a little bit. I'm not sure.
Okay. How would you turn this concept to a program of responsa a day, or different responsa for that particular day? In other words, you have obviously Daf Yomi, Mishnah day, Halacha day, and there's kind of like an order to it, right? Not connected specifically to that day. How would you do that? Like what? How would you envision this program, unless it's been set up already?
It's sort of been set up already on the OU website, ou.org. There is a half-hour tape, audio by me, on each one of the days of the calendar when it's relevant and possible. So the answer is you could theoretically just learn through them. At the back of the book as well, I gave a list, I think by the calendar, I gave a list of the tshuvot. Yeah, by the calendar. So you could theoretically, if somebody wanted to sit down and learn the tshuvot themselves. I also summarized many of them in Torah musings, where Rabbi Gil Studentis hosted me for a long, long time. So many of them are summarized there in English, but I did an audio tape, so you could listen to the tape where you can learn the tshuvot from the list. And I guess it is true that when I started, some part of me wanted to do something that wasn't the usual Yomi learning, Daf Yomi. And I thought there would be something exciting about also learning the tshuva literature, the Responsa literature, in something like that way.
Okay. Maybe this is a little too complicated, maybe too detailed. How does one determine in a responsa when the writer puts in a date, whether that's the date it was completed, the date it was started? In other words, it's conceivable that someone can start a responsa on a day and then take their time in writing it, or how do you determine that?
I don't think that's what happens. First of all,
okay.
not all responsa have dates.
Okay,
that's one thing, right? So there are a lot of responsa I didn't access to, didn't have dates. And I think the later you go in history, so the earliest responsa that I found with a date was a tshuva of the Bach from like 1600. So they knew about dates before, they just didn't have this idea of dating responsa. So that means that, my discussion leaves out a lot already. Then sometimes you have the question will be written with a date and the answer will be written with a date. Now, it seems to me, I can't prove this, but it seems to me they dated it when they finished it. Either they wrote it all in one day or they did when they finished it. I'm not sure why I think that's true, but it seems to me that I think that's true. I think it's true partially because sometimes they apologize at the beginning of a tshuva, and it's interesting to watch who apologizes for how much of a delay. Like the tshuvot that are 8 months later with no apology, and tshuvot with 2 weeks later with an apology. I'm sorry I didn't get to it till just now. So I don't know. I can't prove that question. I think they dated it when they were done. And remember, the tshuvot that I'm seeing are the ones that either they or they're the people taking care of their writings after they passed away chose to include in the book. So when they choose to include in the book, they leave the date on it. I guess they think it's the date when it was finished, when it's a completed product.
Okay. At the beginning of the book, Rabbi Rothstein, you take a number of months and focus on those months and try to develop a theme, or I guess as you call it, underlying unity for those months. Nisan, of course, Passover, Pesach, Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah and the holidays, and Adar Sheni, which is probably just a complicated month in terms of what do we do in Adar Sheni. What were your conclusions? What did you find for those 3 different months?
So I just found a bunch of different themes that come up. Interestingly, Pesach wasn't like a theme of and it could be, one of the problems here is, since I was choosing, it could be that I shied away from Pesach because I didn't want to be stereotypical. But when I was looking at the months, what I found in Pesach was a discussion of how people's thoughts, how their internal experience affects their view of halacha. So there was a tshuva about pain medication, for example, where the pain medication itself might cause bodily harm, and you're allowed to risk the harm to get the pain relief. And Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's tshuva talks about the fact that pain is this terrible thing for people, and so the fact that they have such pain is good enough to allow this to happen. So there are a bunch of tshuvot like that. Rabbi Uziel has a tshuva where he talks about the psychology of the mogda b'mikta. There's a concept in halacha that if somebody is accused of owing somebody else money, and they say, "I don't owe you half of what you said or a third of what you said," they have to take an oath about it. And Rabbi Uziel gets to the psychology of the person that would lead the Torah to legislate it that way. That was one kind of a theme of when Poskim are thinking about what's going on inside the person in their thoughts as they're figuring out the halachic issue. I had another 7 tshuvot, another bunch of tshuvot in Nisan about Torah study and the belief in Hashem that has to come with that Torah. The belief in God that has to come with that Torah study. So there was a Tzitz Eliezer where he said, this is very interesting, the lawyers for a woman who had apparently converted to the Anglican Church, but now wanted to come back to Judaism. But the law in England was that if you had become a member of the Anglican Church, you couldn't go back to Judaism. So the lawyers wanted to know if Judaism thought of her as having left Judaism. And she says no, and that was going to help her not have to be considered a member of the Anglican Church. And Rabbi Moshe finds in the tshuva where he warns parents to be sure that the education their kids are getting will make sure that they not only learn material of Torah, they'll also be instilled with the proper belief in God and things like that. Then a bunch of tshuvot about marriage, and then some tshuvot about what do you do when a situation is b'di'evet or sha'at chak, when you have halachic pressure, when it's not the usual situation. So that came up a few times, as did issues of food. So that's what you got in Nisan. So meaning, the reason I put those 3, it wasn't particularly to those 3 months. My point was to try to show how I eventually came to my overall themes. Meaning, I could have just taken the whole calendar and seen what themes come up again and again throughout the calendar. But that would have meant, let's say I just had 4 tshuvot, but they focused so many times on some issue, they could have excess weight. To try to avoid that, I chopped it up by month to see each month's thing, and then I had 13 months. But I just didn't include in the book because it would get too long and too detailed and wasn't going to help the reading of the book. So those were Nisan's ideas. Tishray's ideas are things about like how to join a community. This is Yami Noraim. The Tzitz Eliezer, this is something I unfortunately do a lot, because let's say you come into shul late and you missed, I don't do that as much as I want to say. I hope I don't do it so much. But let's say you come into shul late and you want to join Chazarat Shots. So a lot of people will just do a Hecha Kedusha. They'll start with the Shliach Tzibor, they'll go to Kedusha, and they'll say it then. So his question was, let's say somebody's davening on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and the Chazan starts the repetition of the Shemona Esrei when they're still in the 3rd bracha, right? That's all as far as they got. Can they join Kedusha? So he in fact says he doesn't think you can, but that's discussion about how and when we join communities. There were a bunch of tshuvot like that. And Rabbi Tzvi Frank, who I knew not at all before I started this study, but got to know him a little bit through tshuvot. And they were starting a Reformed rabbinical seminary in Jerusalem, and they wrote strongly opposing it, hoping that it wouldn't happen. So those are communal issues. In Tishrei, this is a Yom Noraim thing, but it's Orla and Shemitah come up. Like Rav Gestetner has a tshuva, can use Orla. Orla is the produce of the first 3 years of a fruit tree, and you're not going to get any benefit from it. So can you use it for schach? Is that a benefit? Usually we say mitzvahs aren't a benefit. So things about oil and Shemitah came up a lot in that year, because that's when the Shemitah would start as well. And then things about prayer and about brachos, about marriages. And then in Adar Sheni, also tshuvot about issues of when can you trust people or not. Like Rosh Hashanah has a tshuva about how much supervision do you have to have over a factory. The factory is not in town. How good does the supervision have to be? Rav Herzog has a tshuva. Remember, Herzog is the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the state of Israel. So he has a bunch of really interesting tshuvot about how to interact with the state. He has a beautiful tshuva, not relevant to our discussion. Just always remember it as a tshuva when the members of Gush Etzion were under siege in 48, and they fell just before the state was declared. When they were under siege, they wrote a tshuva. They wrote a question, a shayla, to Herzog about what they could and couldn't do on Shabbos. And they asked him this, even though he had already sent them a telegram saying, whatever you think you need to do, go ahead and do. And they said the detailed tshuva. Okay, here he has a tshuva about, can you volunteer for a mission on Shabbos? And he says, you have to trust your commanders. You have to trust that if commanders say that it has to happen on Shabbos, then it must be it has to happen on Shabbos. So that's issues of trust and trusting people. Then you have issues about marriage. Again, marriage comes up a tremendous amount in the Tshuvot. The Noda Yehuda had a discussion about, the Noda Yehuda lives in the late 1700s. So I think we often think that leaving Judaism is a is a plague of our time, and it certainly is, but he has a responsa about a groom who breaks an engagement when the bride's grandfather left Judaism. And the family said he shouldn't have the right to break the engagement without financial penalties because the bride's grandfather had already not been eating kosher when they got engaged. So he should have known. And the Noda says, no, this is more, and this is significantly different, and therefore, yeah, you don't have to do that. So those are the other sheni issues. Then you have issues of what's a d'Rabbanan, what's a d'Oraita, what's a biblical law, what's a rabbinic law. You have issues of faith. You have issues of how do we interact with non-Jews. These are some of the issues that come up.
Okay. Let's go to marriage because, as you said, it comes up a lot. What were some of the conclusions that you draw from the responsa that you saw dealing with marriage?
Well, it was that how central marriage is to these poskim, how much it comes up, and how much they care about it. They care about it in two ways. They care about preserving marriage that can be preserved. So you'll have times when you'll have a posting that's approached by a couple, and there seems to be good reasons they have to separate, but they don't want to. But there seems like good reasons they have to separate, and the posting will help them not separate. There are other times when the posting will say no, they have to separate, and one partner is trying to make it not happen, and they'll try hard to help them out. So for men, it's sometimes easier. They'll give them a heter me'erabanim. They'll find a way for them to be able to remarry. Here's an example of where nobody's at fault, but let's say one spouse, one husband or wife goes crazy and is institutionalized. So halakhically, you can't really have a divorce in that situation. It becomes very difficult. I actually know a case in the last 5 years of a man, sadly, who developed early onset Alzheimer's, and they arranged to get quickly because they didn't want her to be stuck. So the idea of not having men or women be stuck, that was a huge idea. A huge issue. And then on the other hand, when a couple's in a marriage, trying to make sure the marriage goes smoothly and well. So issues of nida and helping a couple not get tripped up or not get separated by nida issues more than halacha requires. These are issues that came up frequently in the thing. And then there's always, when it comes with marriage and anything, there's the money issues, the money sides of marriages. Those are the things that I know. But the thing that struck me was how central an institution it is in the Poskim's understanding of a Jewish life.
So you're seeing similar questions and issues regarding the centrality of marriage, whether it's the Chatam Sofer in the 1800s or Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 20th century.
Right. Correct. Yes, I think that's right. Yes, we're seeing that. That's one of the things that I think is interesting. Yeah, we're seeing it come up over and over again in many different eras and times, and among many different poskim.
Okay. What were some of the interesting money issues that appeared in the poskim? Not marriage money issues, but money issues.
Right. So one interesting set of things was how are you allowed to earn a living? And so sometimes the posting will be lenient, sometimes the posting will be stringent. And how they decide, I don't know, but it's interesting to watch. So let's say, if you, in their time anyway, if you have a fish business, so you catch a lot of fish and you're going to package them, you're going to sell them. But along there, you're always going to have non-kosher fish that comes along in the thing. So you'll separate them out. Can you sell them to a non-kosher factory? Usually, the halacha is you're not supposed to make a living off of non-kosher food. So does this fit or does it not fit? Right? And that'll affect the ability. That a similar question came up with meat and making hot dogs and stuff like that. You have to take some non-kosher meat from the supplier along the way. Could you sell that off to somebody else who was willing to take it? Could you become a firefighter? So the answer was asking, you be a firefighter on Shabbos, because while it's not part of the job, it's not part of the job to be a firefighter to work on Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's going to come up. Right, it's going to happen. So are you allowed to do it? Right. So there's a little discussion about that because the guy wants to make a living. I think it talks about how important it is to make a living, and therefore he wants to help the guy out. He wants to help him do this. On the other hand, Rav Uziel was asked about whether a milkman can make his deliveries on Shabbos. Now there's an Eruv, and the milkman, to his credit, wasn't going to ride his bike like he usually did during the week. He was going to pull his large milk container from which he poured off to everybody. And everybody says, you can't do it. That's what you do during the week. You can't do that. So you can't do it. And that's where Rav Uziel had it. So things like that. How do you make a living? What's allowed to make a living? What? Then you get into questions of, there's different halachos for movable property as opposed to real estate, and you get to those kinds of questions. In questions of how you give charity, what counts for maaser ksafim or not. Right? Somebody asked Rav Uziel if he could use his tenth that he set aside for mitzvah purposes to buy land in Israel. Rav Uziel thought largely not, because that's a separate mitzvah that already exists, and you can't use your maaser ksafim money for a separate mitzvah. As opposed to Rav Yosef, this is to me a poignant tshuva. He was asked about a community was raising money in Tehran in 1972. They were raising money because they had to expand the shul because it wasn't big enough, and they had to build a mikveh. And they raised a whole bunch of money, but not enough for both. So they wanted to know, A, could they use the money, just all of it for one? And B, which? So he says, you build the mikveh, you don't build the shul. But when I read the tshuva, it hurt me a little bit, because that's 1972. 1979, the Shah gets kicked out of power, and everything goes terrible for the Jews. And we never know. Jews are building places, building things. You never know whether what you're building is going to stand or stay or not. But those are some of the money issues that come up. And there's issues of damages and inheritance, and that comes up in money issues as well.
Were there any issues regarding other occupations? Can I become a doctor because I'm going to have to, do all these different things, even though they're perhaps pikuach nefesh? Was there anything on that? Firefighter sounds, now you're going to, like, a little kid, your child says, I want to be a firefighter when I grow up. So at least you have a responsa to show him whether he could do it or not. But okay.
So there are certainly tshuvot about whether kohanim can become doctors.
Okay.
I don't think I had any in my list, in my group, but I know there are such tshuvot. There were interesting tshuvot about, once you're a doctor, what you can and cannot do. In terms of violating, Rav Moshe has a tshuva about violating Shabbat to save a non-Jew. A very interesting tshuva. The sister of the Ezra had it was asked tshuva by a guy who lived in the old city, and he wanted to move to Efrat. If he moved to Efrat, he might have to drive more on Shabbos. There'll be all these issues of, could you drive, and could you have the non-Jew? The hospital had a non-Jewish driver, but could you use it? Whatever. But along the way, the sister of the Ezra says, but since you're asking, if you have the ability, you shouldn't leave the old city because you're living in the old city. So it's an interesting thing, but so there are tshuvot about lots of tshuvot about doctors and plying their trade, but not. And there are tshuvot out there I know of about kohanim becoming doctors, but I didn't see those in my group.
Okay. What are some of the overall themes when dealing with non-Jews, the non-Jewish society at large? And I would assume that perhaps the issues might be different depending on whether the posek lived in Israel or lived outside of Israel?
I didn't see a huge difference in those terms. I see why you would think so. I didn't notice it. I'm not saying it wasn't there. I'm saying I didn't notice it. What I did notice was, one was, a lot of it was about the critical nature of these relationships. The desire to have positive relationships, at the same time as making sure that they don't shade over into becoming, just ordinary relationships where they're just our good friends and we just think of them as the same and different. So in the late 1700s, the Noda B'Yehuda and Rabbi Yaakov Ebner lived right around the same time as each other. It seemed to have been an issue. Rabbi Noda B'Yehuda was asked about, is it okay to lie in court? There was rumor that Jews are allowed to lie in non-Jewish court. And so he writes a tshuva saying, of course you can't lie in non-Jewish court. Rabbi Yaakov Emden has a tshuva where somebody comes to him and says, shouldn't we punish that guy for testifying against a fellow Jew in non-Jewish court? And Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, no, there's plenty of evidence that whatever was a loan that was being denied, there's plenty of evidence the loan existed. The non-Jewish court calls you to testify. You have to testify. You have to tell them what's going on. So that's one kind of an issue. I mentioned just a second ago, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on the whole issue of being a doctor on Shabbos. One of the things he says is that you absolutely have to save non-Jewish lives if you're in a position to save them, because if they ever got any inkling of the fact that Jews resist saving non-Jewish lives, the Jewish community would have an untenable situation in the world. So those are one set of issues that come up. On the other hand, you want to maintain separation, right? So I said tshuva about Thanksgiving. He was somewhat hesitant to allow the observance of Thanksgiving. He thought it was too much of an involvement with non-Jewish practices. The Street of the Aces is a tshuva about playing an organ at a cemetery dedication. He thought that was too much of a non-Jewish practice. Reb Chaim David HaLevi thought birthday parties were okay, even though maybe they have maybe they seem like a non-Jewish practice of, no, you're just celebrating and thanking God for another year. Rav Kook as a Jew, he wrote to a community in Italy, where the local Muslim community in Italy, I didn't realize there was a Muslim community in Italy, wanted property in the Jewish cemetery. And Rav Kook was extremely opposed to having them have part of a Jewish cemetery. He said, if you can't get away from it, Rav Kook thought, you could say to them, it's not our practice to have other religions be buried in our cemetery. He thought they would accept that. They wouldn't be upset about it. But he said, if you can't get around it, you should sell them part of the cemetery, not have them do it in the Jewish cemetery. So that's Rav Kook on that separation issue. And then you have issues of conversions, what counts as conversion, what doesn't count as conversion, where do we trust non-Jews, where we don't trust non-Jews, things like that. So those were non-Jewish issues that come up and we're dealing with them.
And you would mention that some of the Responsa during Nisan dealt with the study of Torah and the intent that one has to have in the study of Torah. So what did you uncover, Rabbi Rothstein, regarding the role, the centrality of Torah in the Responsa that you reviewed?
So I did mention those tshuvot. I will say that when I looked at the study of Torah and how it came up in the response to the whole, one of the big issues was the relationship we're supposed to have with Torah scholars, right? And the importance of the centrality of Torah scholars should be ideally to our lives and to being involved with them and relating to them, and giving them the proper honor, the proper cover, where that comes up, where it doesn't come up. There's an interesting, fascinating, it's two tshuvot in the Khatam Sofer, where there's a guy who clearly seems to be on his way to reform, whether he was reformed yet or not, but had gotten some kind of reputable smicha, so he knew more than a little bit, and he was summoned to a court case by a court, and he said, I don't have to go to that case, I'm a much greater Torah scholar than they are. So that issue of, summoning a Torah scholar, who you respect, who you don't respect, that comes up a bunch of times in the tshuvot. And I guess I thought it was interesting because it reminds us that, and I just had this conversation with somebody recently. I was having a conversation. Somebody said, if somebody knows a lot of Torah, they're a Torah scholar and you can learn Torah from them. And sometimes that's not true. Unfortunately, there are people who know a lot, and yet they're not the kind of people we should be learning Torah from. And that's an issue. That's a concern. Comes up in these tshuvot. I'm not sure people are aware. And of course, there's the study itself, the importance of the study, and how you set yourself up for proper study. And then there's the idea of the study and the impact the study should have on each of us as we study, meaning it's not about the material and the fact. It's about, so aside from the reverence for Torah scholars, there's the material itself and the impact. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is the story I was about to tell. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was asked, somebody said to him, I've been through half of Shas. And he says, okay, but has it been through you? And so that's an issue that comes up in the tshuvot as well, making sure that we study Torah in a way that fosters our proper service of God. And then the last interesting piece was there are more than a few tshuvot about the sanctity of the scrolls themselves or the appurtenances of the scrolls, the Aron Kodesh, ink on the page, the coverings, and things like that. So those were the tshuvot, those were the Torah issues that I saw.
Does one get the impression when the Poskim are writing what you mentioned earlier, Rabbi Rothstein, in terms of the importance of Torah study and the importance of giving respect and kavod, that these Poskim could have written separate Musar sefers or separate Hashkafa sefers, but since they're Poskim and they're getting questions and they're answering questions, this is a chance to get some of these themes and some of these thoughts in the psak itself.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Meaning, I think people write in the literatures that are comfortable for them. Now, many Poskim did write other Sfarim as well, and other kinds of Sfarim. Right. I guess I'm more experienced it as part of their communication with this person. This is what they felt important to communicate in this content. So when it came up, it was part of their view of the picture as a whole. Meaning, if it's what you're saying, I guess it's almost maybe even somewhat less interesting, because then it means there's a Musar side of our life, and then there's a halacha side of our lives, and while they were there, they threw in the Musar side. Whereas to me, it seemed more unified. It was that the halacha side of their discussion involved that Musar side and needed that Musar side as part of the halachic discussion, and the halachic discussion would be lacking if it didn't have it.
Okay, got it. Okay. You had mentioned earlier, Rothstein, that the Chatam Sofer is often quoted by later Poskim.
Yeah.
Um, who did you find the main group of poskim that you utilized? Who did they quote aside, of course, from the Chatzim Sofer? Again, some people have the impression that when they go through the psakim of Rav Yosef, there is always a litany of sources. It's like overwhelming. Bang, 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 bang. And other poskim, you don't get that. Um, who are some of the main sources that you, in a unified approach, you saw being used?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Rav Yosef is certainly an outlier in what he quotes. Actually, at some point, I made a whole list of who quotes how many sources are quoted. I forget. It's not he's way at one end of the bar graph, right? But Poskim tended to quote the Gemara, the Bavli, the Gemara, and the Rambam, and Shulchan Aruch, and Tanakh. And from that, they pretty much built their halachic worldview from, I mean, they had other poskim as well, they had other things as well. They had, Rashi and Tosus, Rishonim, but over and over again, these were the sources being quoted to establish halakha.
Okay.
It's an interesting question because you talk about Rabbi Yosef, right? And I think about Rabbi Yosef as opposed to, let's say, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who's not a big quoter. And what he quotes is much more in that realm, in that core group of texts, and yet I don't think we think either one of them is more authoritative than the other. So it's an interesting thing to notice that there's a minimum you have to be able to be a posek, but then what you do with it is almost as important as how much you're quoting. Right? The Tzitzi Eliezer are quoted widely, but not nearly as much as Rav Yosef. But I don't think we inherently think Rav was more authoritative than Tzitzi Eliezer. I think we judge it on the merits of the topic or whatever it was. So it's an interesting thing to think about. What do you quote? Why do you quote? What's important to quote or not?
As opposed to, again, I might be saying something that's not accurate in terms of what the impressions are of people. There's this thought that someone like Moshe Feinstein, he had the Gemara, and he was able to develop everything from the Gemaras. He didn't, not that he didn't need, he didn't refer to perhaps other earlier poskim, like maybe some, like in Rav Yosef. But that's not to say necessarily that Rav Yosef couldn't have done it from the Gemaras as well.
I think that's an exaggeration of it. It is true. Moshe Feinstein is willing to say, I have a reading of this Gemara. I'm sure this is the correct reading of the Gemara, and build a psak from there. He does do that. He doesn't only quote Gemaras though, but he does quote, in my impression, he does mostly quote the Gemara and everything that's in the volume of the Vilna Shas, right? The Rambam and everything that's in the volume of the Rambam, and the Torah and Shulchan Aruch, I think it's those volumes. He knew those cold and built halacha from it. He knew other stuff too. I'm not doubting that he did, but that's not what he built his halacha from. It is a very interesting contrast to watch. He did build from a much narrower set of sources, but not quite as independent as just I'll read the Gemara. Right? That would be almost, to me, almost a negative. If somebody were to say, "Well, I'll just read the Gemara and know what it is," that I don't think we think you're allowed to do. But it is true that he knew the Gemara extremely well, and then he knew the Rambam, he knew the Shulchan Aruch, and between the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and the Nosei Kelim and the people around them, you do get a pretty good representation of halachic discussion, halachic discourse.
Rothstein, in all of the incredible work that you did, what surprised you the most about the results?
The most. There's so many things that surprised me. It was really such a pleasure of surprises. I think one of the big surprises was how central the Chatam Sofer was. I always heard the name, and I don't want to say this the wrong way, but in the world that I grew up in, he was kind of thought of as this very right-wing guy, and then you read his Shivot, it's not true. Like he's just a great Torah scholar who's well thought out, knows a lot, and teaches Torah. That experience over and over again, I think, is maybe one of my big experiences. That when you learn the writings of a gadol, of a great Torah scholar, they taste different. They're just Torah, And even I among the five that we spoke about, and others as well, I really love the Tzitzi Eliezer. I loved others too, but I had a very personal that just sort of appealed to me in a way. There were times when he write things that I disagreed with, but it was always so, it was moderate and well thought out and placed in that was the experience of Torah I had hoped for. I wouldn't say I didn't hope for it, but I was surprised by how often that came up and that happened. And I'll say one other thing that surprised me, we mentioned this already, was the wide variation in numbers of sources that you use. But that gets to this other thing that's surprising, was that what makes Rav Moshe or Rav Vadia or the Chasam Sofer more authoritative than other people? That was a big surprise to me, that question, because there would be people who I would have thought, whose Chuvot read to me, and I won't name names, but whose Chuvot read to me like they were on a level with them, and yet they weren't, right? And any Chuvah that I picked up is written by somebody who knows well these basic sources, whatever they may be, and they're writing Chuvot. And yet some of them I can read and say, I know why this guy never made it, and I'm not naming names. But other times there are other people who I would have read and I thought, this is really great stuff. And yet, and they're respected, but they're not a revocation, they're not a Ravadia, they're not right to that. So that was a big surprise to me, that question of how you become that level of authority.
Okay. And in conclusion, Rabbi Rothstein, what's next? Fiction, nonfiction, a break from writing?
So I don't do anything else, so I have to write. Otherwise, I really am not doing anything.
Okay.
So I'm working on a few things. I write for Gil Student twice a week on TorahMusings.com.
Right.
One of them is on the Parsha. And so I started a few years ago. I started with finding 5 Rashis a week on the Parsha and just presenting them. I am slowly building up a collection of comments that I just collected over the years that I hope one day to put together into a book where it'll be a similar kind of an idea. Here I have 30 comments on Psukim in the Parsha by various people at various times. What are the themes that underlie the Parsha according to them as a whole? I think that'll one day be a book like that. I'm right now working on Eved Kenani and thinking a lot about it. I think it's a very important topic. These partially converted people who were slaves in some sense, and what does it mean? And you'll find some people will say they're really basically Jews, they just happen to be Avadim. Others who will seem to say they're basically non-Jews, they just happen to keep a lot of mitzvahs. And what's their role, and why is there a role like that within the Torah world? Fiction is always a possibility, but I have to write fiction that people will read. My most recent fiction book was a book called like you said, The Making of the Messiah 2048, which really nobody read. So to write fiction that nobody reads is worthless. Like there's no point to it.
Okay.
You write Torah that nobody reads, you at least hope you've written some good Torah.
Well, we urge our viewers and listeners to look at all of Rabbi Rothstein's works. Obviously, the Judaism of the Poskim, but the other works as well. And as we mentioned, this is a Mosaica Press series, and urge our listeners and viewers not only to look at all of Rabbi Rothstein's works, but also to go on to MosaicaPress.com and see all the wonderful work, including the Judaism of the Poskim. Rabbi Rothstein, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you as well. I had a great time. Thank you.